Well, hello and welcome to another video by Financial Learning. On today's video, we're going to take a look at the Bitcoin mining sector for the week ending November 14th. We're going to look at that nasty price action here in the Bitcoin mining sector, compare that against the price of Bitcoin and against the price of MicroStrategy, and of course, the short interest rankings for these 16 different stocks. Now, we'll take a look at some of the news that did come out to see if any of that bullish news was maybe overshadowed by the drop in price of Bitcoin. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, and starting at the left-hand side, you're going to see each of these 16 different stock ticker symbols, and the ones that are yellow means that they did change places in terms of short rankings for this past week. Now, we'll start with CleanSpark and Core Scientific. They actually swap places here in the top five. We now see that CleanSpark is now number 4 on the list, and then the entire bottom of the Bitcoin mining sector has swapped around. There's been a lot of movement, and a lot of that has to do with some of the news that did come out. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but just wanted to kind of brief you on that. Now, moving on past that, let's look at the price action. You can see all of the companies except for American Bitcoin Mining Company actually had a red week. Now, the Friday was still red for the entire sector, and that is because of the price of Bitcoin. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can see here, looking at the weekly percent changes, I bolded all the ones that had greater than 20% down, as well as any of the companies that happen to have a positive week. As I mentioned, American Bitcoin Mining had a positive week and they came in at 4.7% up on the week. The rest of the mining sector had a pretty terrible week. Now, we'll just start with the top instead of going from the largest drop and work our way around because there's just so many to cover. Terawulf had a negative 21.2% week. Mara had a negative 24.4% week. BitDR, they actually led the pack in terms of a terrible week with a negative 52.2% on the week. We'll talk a little bit about their news in just a little bit. Now, past them, you're going to see CleanSpark had a pretty bad week as well at a negative 29.6%. Also, Core Scientific came in negative 26.1. IREN actually had a negative 25.7%. So again, regardless of some of the bullish news we heard over the past couple of weeks with some of these companies, it just was not enough to help support the price action. Of course, anytime a stock starts to hit its all-time high, there's going to be some form of a pullback. I do believe the price of Bitcoin was just a lot more aggressive on the pullback, unfortunately, for some of these stocks. Now, continue on. You can see CIFR here had a negative 30.6% week, and Bitfarms had a negative 29.5% week. BTBT was the next one in this group with a 23.2% drop for the week. And then a couple more, again, had greater than 20% drops. HIVE had a negative 29.6% drop, and Canaan had a negative 25% drop. So those were some of the worst drops. And again, it was the majority of this sector here. But I did mention silver lining on the intro. Let's take a look at that next. You're going to see Max Payne. All of the items that had green on this coming week means that the market makers would like to see the price of the stock actually increase a little bit for them to make the most on the options chain. So I'll be interested to see if there's any opportunity for some of these stocks to have a little bit of a better week. We'll have to wait and see. Will we get some additional options that kind of neutralize some of the bullish benefit here, the silver lining? We'll have to wait and see. Now, I didn't really talk about green versus red in terms of share price for Friday because, as I mentioned, the entire sector was red. So, unfortunately, none of them had a great day on Friday. But moving on into the shares being shorted, now we're going to talk a lot about some of the short interest changes and correlate that with some of the news that did come out. But let's just jump into some of the details here. You're going to see some of these stocks actually have the cells red. That means that the short interest on Friday actually reduced compared to that Thursday trading period. And then the ones that are green means that the short interest increased on Friday compared to Thursday's trading periods. Now, you're going to see some pretty high short interest numbers. We're sitting at 36% for Terawulf And we have quite a bit of companies actually above 20% for this week and actually on the day. So, taking a look at some of these, we'll get into some more details here and I'll compare the weekly change, but the next thing I want to talk about is going to be that free float. And you can see here the ones that just changed to yellow are the ones that actually changed their free float quantities when we're looking at it this week compared to last week. And some of them had pretty significant changes. And we got a lot of updates this past week because of some of the earnings that did come out. And we'll talk about the earnings when we cover each individual stock on the weekly news portion. But you can see here that TeraWulf had 9.5 million shares get added to their free float. BitDR had 2.5% added, and you can see here IREN had 9.4 million shares getting added to their free float. Another big one would be CIFR with a 4.5 million share increase, and then by far the largest change in terms of that free float percent would be Canaan. They had 195.6 million shares getting added to their free float this week compared to just a week ago. So that is a very, very high change in terms of the free float. And you can see here that Canaan had a negative 25% week. We'll talk a little bit about some of the news that did come out. I did talk last week about some of the additional shares that were registered for Canaan. So again, we'll get into some of that again this week when we talk about each of these individual companies' news articles. But before we do, let's jump into that weekly short interest change. So looking at some of the highest changes, whether it be up or down, we'll start with the highest increase on short interest, and that would actually be with Bitfarms. They saw an increase of 6.18% on the week. So they jumped up pretty high. They were sitting in the sub 10 ranking in terms of the short interest, and they have jumped all the way to number 8 on our list. And again, they had just a massive amount of short interest increase. And again, we'll talk about some of the news that I do believe attributed to some of that short interest change. Now, another thing I wanted to point out that we had quite a bit of shares getting added to the float. The fact that we're still sitting rather high means that the short interest quantity of shares actually increased quite a bit in order for them to maintain or slightly increase that short interest percent. So one example would be TeraWulf. They actually dropped their short interest by 1.17%. But what I wanted to point out was the fact that they added 9.5 million shares to their overall float. Now, when you typically add shares to the float, if the number of shares being shorted do not increase, then your short percent would absolutely have to decrease. But we're seeing, again, a lot of these short interest increases, even though the free float has increased. So, again, that means that we're getting a lot more short interest share count also being added for each of these companies. Now, looking at the largest drop in terms of short interest, it was actually CIFR with a negative 1.93%. All right, and we'll jump over into the news this week. And you can see, starting with TeraWulf, they had a $50.6 million revenue. So they did announce their earnings, and we'll go over a little bit more of those right now. They also included in that revenue number 7.2 million for HPC. So we are starting to see a good amount of HPC revenue hitting the books on some of these stocks that actually pivoted a little bit earlier. So we'll have to compare some of the other earnings and see just how they're doing again as HPC peers in this sector. And on top of that, let's talk about the cash. They had a total of 712.8 million cash on hand, and they actually accounted for a $455 million net loss. Now, a good chunk of that $455 million loss was because of fair value changes of some of their warrants and derivatives. So, regardless of all of that, they ended up announcing a negative $1.13 loss per share. Now, that was the news that they came out with. And of course, if you want to jump into the details of each of these different earning statements, I will share a link to Bitcoin mining stock IO. And on that site, you can jump into more details, check out the press releases, and look at quite a bit of different metrics that is shared on that site. Now we'll jump down to the next company that put out news, and it was actually BitDR. BitDR also announced earnings. They had 169.7 million in revenue. 43 million of that was an adjusted EBITDA, and $266.7 million was their net loss. So again, another Bitcoin mining slash HPC company having a loss for the quarter. Now, they had a total of 196.3 million in cash and 246.2 million in crypto. So, all in all, at least they both still had some good cash on the books. And then you can see they actually had their mining numbers come out. They had mined 511 Bitcoin for this last month here in October. And their treasury is now sitting at 2,233 Bitcoin. Now, they announced their hash rate. It's currently sitting at 41.2 exahash. And they had $8 million of AI Cloud ARR. So this is based off of future state contracts and some of their other HPC equipment being plugged in. They are now planning at the end of the year to have $8 million in revenue here in their cloud service stream. So that's good news here for BitDeer. Now, they also announced 13 megawatts of one of their data centers is going to be getting converted over to AI, and this is going to be at their Washington location. Also, they have another 10 megawatts at a Knoxville location that's also going to be getting converted over into this HPC AI. Now, they had some not great news come out as well, and it involved one of their operational sites here. It was a fire at the Massillon site. If I'm saying it wrong, let me know in the comments. They also announced a $400 million convertible note having a 4% interest rate, and also another note in terms of some additional shares at $148.4 million with 5.28% in interest. So a lot of various notes and different share offerings coming out here for BitDeer, and I do believe that was a good reason as to why some of their shares were dropping so much compared to the rest of the sector. Now, they are hedging some of the future dilution by having a cap call transaction associated with one of these convertibles. And they did actually announce that they will be repurchasing some of the 2029 convertible notes. So, again, they're trying to true up some of their old convertible debt in terms of equity and shares into new convertible notes. Also, they have announced the interest rate for each of these different offerings, whether it be convertibles or whether it be in privately negotiated shares. Just wanted to point those two items out. And those are the updates here for BitDeer. And continuing on in terms of the convertibles, the next news article is going to be CleanSpark. They announced a $1.15 billion convertible note. This note has 0% interest and it has a 27.5% conversion premium. So that means that the current price that was negotiated in the terms for closing needs to be increased by 27.5% in order for them to be able to exercise. And the exercise date is pretty far away into 2032. Now, there are some caveats where this specific convertible can be exercised as early as 2029, but that would mean that the exercise price would have to be 130% of the converted price. So instead of around $19, it would need to be closer to about $23, $24 in order to be able to convert. So again, if you are a shareholder of CleanSpark and you're wondering at which time and price those shares are going to be converted, those are going to be the numbers that you're going to want to pay attention to. Also, as part of this convertible note offering, they also announced a $460 million share buyback plan. That actually takes out 10.9% of the current free float, and those shares will be paid out to these convertible note holders upon the exercise date. So again, this is a great way the company is able to combat some of the hedging that could take place by the note holders. A lot of times note holders will take a short position and hedge that against their long exposure in terms of those convertible notes, whereas CleanSpark has pretty much reduced the float to the point where it may not make a lot of sense. It may not be wise to increase the short percent by that much because that's going to actually expose them to a pretty volatile share price, in my opinion. And another portion that did come out from CleanSpark was just a little bit of clarity behind this convertible note offering, and it had to do with the insiders. Matthew Schultz stated that there is a 45-day share lockup period by the insiders where they will not be selling any of their shares. So that should maybe give the assurance to any of the current shareholders that are concerned that the insiders will dump the shares because of their fear of the short attack on the stock and the reduction in share price. Now, the insiders, they have quite a bit of shares. So again, it's in their best interest to see the share price appreciate, so we'll see what kind of news, what kind of activities they're able to share with the shareholders in the weeks and months to come. Now, on top of that, they also announced what they're going to be doing with the money. One of the things they're going to be doing is going to be paying off their line of credit. So they have a Coinbase and a 2 Prime line of credit. Those line of credits will be paid off because they did have a pretty high single digit interest rate. And again, with that, that does still provide them the liquidity, the optionality to go ahead and utilize that collateral. However, for the time being, until it's needed, they're not going to be paying any kind of interest. So just want to make sure that I do point that out. They're also going to be utilizing the rest of the money outside of the share buyback, outside of the line of credit payoff, to go ahead and purchase powered land infrastructure for the HPC data center. So I'm pretty excited as a shareholder in CleanSpark to see them go ahead and roll out some of these sites. They did mention a little bit about Atlanta as a potential conversion, and they also talked a little bit about Texas having now acquired land and energy. So I'm excited and I am curious and anxious as to what kind of news we'll get in the weeks and months to come. Now, outside of CleanSpark, I'm going to jump all the way down to the next company, and that is going to be Bitfarms. They actually announced a little bit of good news as well. They are going to be converting over 18 megawatts in a Washington site to HPC AI. They also announced their earnings. They had $69.2 million in revenue. They also accounted for an $8.7 million net loss, and their loss per share came in at 8 cents loss per share. Now, they do have a significant amount of liquidity, so they're able to do quite a bit here in the short term in terms of maybe acquiring more sites or converting over more of their data centers into HPC AI. They have a total liquidity. This would be a combined cash and crypto of $814 million. So, again, that's quite a bit of money in the bank here for Bitfarms. So, again, pay attention to the news for them to see just how they're going to leverage this capital. Now, the next company I want to share news on is going to be Hive. They have been pushing to hit the 25 exahash by American Thanksgiving, and it looks like they have a really good shot at doing so, as their latest announcement puts them at 24 exahash. They also announced some Bitcoin mining numbers here. They mine 289 Bitcoin. Their efficiency for their fleet is sitting at 17.7 joules per terahash. And again, these are October numbers. They also announced a little bit with one of their subsidiaries, their Buzz, which is their HPC AI department or division, and they announced a tier 3 AI and HPC conversion. And this is an 80 megawatt conversion site here that they are going to be using for HPC. And they also announced another facility here in Toronto, a 7.2 megawatt facility. So, again, just wanted to point it out that not all of these Bitcoin mining companies are putting out these mega hyperscale size sites. And I do see benefits in both ways. Now, if you're putting out maybe a smaller site, some of the benefits means that the seed capital, the initial investment, the equity that the company needs to put in to really get off the ground and start running in terms of that HPC revenue would be smaller than the companies that are being very ambitious and putting in multi-billion dollars of investment in order to build out these HPC hyperscaler sites. Now, a lot of that seed equity is going to need to be put out early for these companies. And of course, if they're successful, they can lock in these deals and monetize all of those megawatts and sometimes even gigawatts. Then the banks are going to be able to take a look at their operations and actually loan them additional money based on the cash flows at these various HPC sites. Now, some of the other news that did come out, we'll start with Canaan. And again, this was one of the companies that didn't have such a great week. They ended up having a negative 25% week. They announced their earnings will be coming out on November 18th. They also gave out their Bitcoin mining numbers for October, and it came in at 92 Bitcoin mined, 1,610 Bitcoin, and 3,950 Ethereum. That is their current treasury. And their hash rate here came in at 9.31 exahash, and efficiency is sitting at a 25.6 joules per terahash. The last update for them would be their power under contract, currently sitting at 230.6 megawatts. Outside of Canaan, I have two more companies that had news, and then we'll jump into the overall sector review and compare that against Bitcoin and MicroStrategy. The next company is going to be BitFuFu. They had their earnings come out. Wanted to go over that with you all. They had 180.7 million in revenue. Their net income actually came in at 11.6. They had an adjusted EBITDA at 22.1 million, so 11.6 million net income, 22.1 million adjusted EBITDA, and they had an earnings per share, not a loss, an earnings per share of 7 cents per share. So again, unlike the other companies, BitFuFu actually had a positive quarter in terms of earnings per share. And one other thing would be the combined cash on hand and digital assets, currently sitting at $254.8 million. So, want to point out, I think BitFuFu had a pretty good quarter, and you can see more of the news and more of those earnings on the bitcoinminingstock.io. Also, I will be speaking with Charlie, their Vice President of Investor Relations, at a later date. I will be sharing that on my X account. Now, the last company that did have news that did come out would be American Bitcoin Mining Company. They had their quarterly earnings and they announced a couple of things in that press release. The first of which would be their new Bitcoin total. It's currently sitting at 3,418 Bitcoin. Their net income for the quarter came in at 3.4 million and their adjusted EBITDA was 27.6 million. Now, one other thing I thought was pretty interesting. So again, they had a positive earnings come out similar to BitFuFu. Now, one thing that caught my eye, and I thought it was a pretty large number. Now, I'd like to get clarification from you all if I'm not understanding this right, but it looks like they had a massive spike in their share count, now sitting at 899,354,931 shares, and that's their shares outstanding. Not sure how much of those shares are restricted. Just looking at the free float, it looks nowhere near this large. So I'm interested in where exactly are all of these shares coming from. If you know, please let me know and drop a comment below. Now that we've finished all of the Bitcoin mining company news, we'll jump into the overall sector. Now, it was a nasty week and it ended up changing to a nasty month for the Bitcoin mining sector. They actually finished the week negative $14,087,000,000 or a drop of 24.01% on the week for the Bitcoin mining sector. Their short interest increased by about 0.03% on the week. Taking a look at the month, not much better actually. They dropped $17.646 billion. So $17,646,000,000 drop. And that comes out to a negative 28.36% on the month for the sector. And the short interest increased compared to a month ago by 0.43%. So again, with a lot of these convertible notes coming out, we are seeing some of the note holders hedging their long exposure now with these notes, and the short interest is climbing quite a bit in this sector. So again, how will companies be combating this? Will we get some bullish catalysts that will help kind of make some of these convertible note holders second guess their short positions? We'll have to wait and see. Also, will the companies look for any ways to combat that in the forms of share buyback or any other ways, maybe insider purchases? Would love to see any of that come out in the weeks and months to come. Now, of course, the other way would have some significant guidance in terms of some revenue. If they are to have maybe, let's say, a 2, 3, 4x in annual revenue, then I do believe that would be significant enough to see a lot of institutional buyers step in and really reduce the overall number of shares still available for trade, which would put a pretty high percentage on that cost to borrow amount. So, again, we'll have to pay attention. If the price of Bitcoin finally rebounds from this slow trickling downward movement we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, then maybe, just maybe, we'll see some of the cost of borrows going up in some of these companies. So, we'll have to wait and see how that comes out. But let's compare the price of Bitcoin to the sector. You can see here that Bitcoin was down on Friday, closing out the day at a $94,397 per Bitcoin. And that equates to a negative 9.4% on the week. On the month, a little bit worse at a negative 12.8%. Now, looking at strategy, it's down 21.1% on the week and 45.1% on the month. So, this is a little bit different than we saw just last week and the last couple of weeks. In this case, the Bitcoin mining sector has finally hit that higher beta in trading and volatility, and it is now worse than the price of Bitcoin on the weekly and also on the monthly. And MicroStrategy is actually a little bit better off this week compared to the overall Bitcoin mining sector. However, on the monthly, the Bitcoin mining sector is still outperforming strategy as it's at a negative 45%. So, what are your thoughts this coming week? Do you think because of the price of Bitcoin kind of teetering around this 93,000 to maybe 97,000 range, we're not going to have a great week for the miners? Do you think we're also going to see another drop in strategy? Or do you think Michael Saylor's purchases of Bitcoin and news that could come out maybe would help the price of Bitcoin as well as help the company's stock price? Love to get your thoughts on that as well. All right, and that about wraps it up for me, folks. I hope you enjoyed this Bitcoin mining sector update. If you did, consider giving the video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on the Bitcoin mining sector. Do you think we're in for a negative week? Love to get that feedback from you. And with all that said, hope you all have a great rest of your week. Keep calm, hash on, and I'll see you on the next one.